Don't fear death, fear a life not lived. You didn't come here by accident. Maybe, deep inside, a part of you is searching for peace. If that's true, subscribe to Buddha Pray and stay until the end of this video, because here, every day, there's a story waiting, just for your soul. Let me ask you something. Have you ever met someone who spent their whole life preparing for death, but forgot how to live? They save, they avoid risks, they fear love, they fear loss, they fear making mistakes. But when the end comes, they realize what truly hurts isn't dying, it's never having lived. Today's story is about a man who thought he could escape pain by playing life safe. But when death finally came, what he feared most wasn't leaving the world, it was never having truly been in it. His name was Thomas Delaney. He lived alone, in a quiet brick house at the edge of a sleepy town. People called him strange, not because he was mean, but because he was always preparing to die. Since he turned 40, he bought his own coffin. He wrote 5 versions of his will. He avoided traveling. He ate the same tasteless food every day. Low salt, low sugar, no spice. He visited doctors twice a year, ran blood tests, read books about longevity. He even planned his own funeral. He said, "If I control everything, then death can't surprise me." He never married, never took risks, never let himself love anyone too deeply. Across the street lived a kind woman named Evelyn. She often waved to him in the mornings, brought him warm soup in the winter, sat outside waiting for a simple hello. But Thomas only nodded, polite, distant, afraid. Years passed. Evelyn aged, and so did he. Still, he never opened the door to her kindness. He feared if he let someone in, it would hurt more to say goodbye. Then one day, a routine checkup turned into something else. The doctor looked at his chart and sighed. "You have liver cancer. It's advanced. You have 3, maybe 4 months." Thomas didn't speak. He just looked at the floor. Number. He had spent 30 years preparing, but when death finally came knocking, he wasn't ready at all. That night, he sat in his quiet kitchen. His untouched dinner grew cold. The walls never felt so silent, and for the first time in decades, Thomas felt afraid, not of dying, but of what he never lived. The next morning, he walked across the street and knocked on Evelyn's door. She opened it, surprised, her eyes soft. He handed her a small envelope, said nothing, just turned around and walked away. Inside was a letter. "Dear Evelyn, I was never brave. I feared death so much. I forgot to live. I watched your kindness from afar, and it scared me. Not because I didn't want it, but because I did. I'm leaving soon. Not because I'm ready, but because I ran out of time. I just wanted to say, your smile, your soup, your quiet waiting was the closest thing I had to being alive. Thank you for waving every day. Thomas." A few weeks later, Thomas passed away. His funeral was simple. No flowers, no crowd, just Evelyn and a small wooden box on her lap filled with postcards he never sent and a photo of her taken from across the street. In Buddhism, we are not taught to fear death. We are taught to fear wasting life, because life isn't just about breathing, it's about waking up, being present, and living fully while we still can. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha says, "Better than 100 years of life lived without wisdom or awareness is one single day lived with mindfulness." Thomas lived 68 years. But how many of those years did he truly feel alive? He tried to avoid death by avoiding pain. He thought if he never loved, he'd never grieve. If he never risked, he'd never lose. But in doing so, he lost something greater, life itself. The Buddha also taught Death is certain. The time of death is uncertain, so live with urgency, live with purpose. Thomas delayed everything: joy, connection, vulnerability. He confused safety with meaning, but the safest life is not always the richest one. Let me ask you, have you ever avoided love because you were afraid to get hurt? Have you ever stayed silent when your heart was full of things to say? Have you ever waited for the right time and it never came? That is the subtle death that happens before our body stops. There is a word in Buddhism, sati. It means mindfulness, but also remembrance. To live with sati is to remember how fragile this life is, how precious each moment truly is. When we live in fear of death, we try to control everything. When we live in awareness of death, we start to appreciate everything, and that changes everything. Thomas didn't need more years. He needed more presence, more courage, to say what he felt, to smile back, to sit in the sun without fear. And maybe that's what we all need, to stop rehearsing for death and start dancing with life. Dear listener, if you're hearing this, maybe there's a part of you that knows how it feels to wait, to hesitate, to plan instead of live. Maybe you've held back your love because you didn't want to be hurt. Maybe you've stayed quiet because you were afraid of what might happen if you spoke your truth. Maybe, like Thomas, you've spent years preparing, but not living. And if that's true, please know this: you're not alone, and it's not too late. The Buddha said, "Do not dwell in the past. Do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment." This moment, the one you're in right now, is your only guarantee, and it's enough to begin again. Don't fear death. It will come, whether you're ready or not. Fear, never saying "I love you." Fear, never forgiving someone or yourself. Fear, never seeing a sunset because you were too busy fearing the night. Your time here is limited, but the depth you can live is limitless. So today, take one small step. Send the message you've been afraid to write. Apologize, even if your pride resists. Hug someone a little longer. Forgive, even if the wound still aches, because those are the things that make life truly worth living. And when your time comes, and it will, you won't be filled with regret. You'll be filled with peace. In the comments, I invite you to answer honestly. What are you still afraid to do? What would you regret if today were your last day? What truth are you still keeping in your heart? Let's talk. Let's be brave together, because sometimes hearing one story can give us the courage to finally live our own. And if this story moved you, please share it. Not for numbers, not for views, but because somewhere, someone is stuck in fear, just like Thomas was. And your share might be the reason they choose to live instead of just survive. Subscribe to Buddha Pray, because here we don't just tell stories, we whisper reminders, we light candles in the dark, and we plant seeds of peace, presence and awakening. You don't need more time, you need more now. So live before it's too late. Are you living or just preparing? If you only had 1 week left, what would you do first? Is it better to live safely or to risk and feel deeply? What's one thing you've been too afraid to do, and why?